critical race theorists' existential perspective is not to seek redemption or sanctification, or forgiveness for that matter, but to define the extent of one's victimhood to make others feel guilty if they disagree with their position, right? Their objective is to define the world in terms of, as we were saying before, oppressors and oppressed, but defining it not in terms of personal improvement. It's in terms of personal revolution and then collective revolution, right? That's the objective.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to the Narrative Podcast. Good to be with you. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, David Mahan, and we're finally all together in the podcast studio again.
It happened, and it's actually looking more and more. This isn't the end result of the podcast studio, but we have like the staples out. No one saw what this actual room looked like.
It's nice.
It was a work in progress, and it all still is a work in progress, but it
changes the acoustics quite a bit.
Exactly.
It does.
Holes in it.
Yeah, seriously.
We're gonna get a nice narrative logo behind on the back wall behind us. We're gonna look legit.
Construction paper and
you could see when David mean mugs us and that was honestly what everyone missed with the recording of the Gala podcast is that like David 9 times out of 10 is just looking so mad at it. We had to literally talk to him about when we went on stage. We said, David, don't look so angry at us all the time. Like you gotta hide your contempt.
He just wears it on his sleeve.
Just focus.
If that's what it takes, by all means.
Exactly.
You can mean mug me all you want if you keep spitting fire like you do for our audience
right
here. Well, we've got a lot to catch up on since we haven't had a news segment in a while. But one thing that came out this week that we wanted to mention was the news that Governor DeWine has signed a bill requiring Ohio schools to create cell phone policies. This is something that we've talked a bit about on the show before, and just like what do schools need to do or what can they do? So let's just kind of maybe rehash some of that conversation, David, and then you can get into some specifics about the bill that was signed, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where everybody's talking about it, right? I mean, parents are always talking about their kids having phones in their hands all the time, and we all know something needs to be done. Did the bill fix that? Probably not, no. Right? I mean, every district already has some sort of policy, and that's really what the bill laid out, was that they're required to have a policy, and that the state is required to, or the Department of Education and Workforce is they have to put out a model policy that doesn't have to be followed, right? The problem is, though, that all the data across the country, even data that we have here in the state of Ohio, says that either you have a full ban on cell phones or nothing at all, because a partial ban just frustrates everybody. And it's not so much that, the kids, okay, the phone is in my pocket for a minute. It's the 20 to 50, notifications that they're waiting for, right? Yeah. That's going to steal their attention span anyway. So it's, okay, thank you, but no thank you.
Yeah. Now, again, it's one of these things where, this is one of those half measures that I think a lot of folks can try to make themselves feel great about. But at the end of the day, it's not addressing the problem, right? And so, is Ohio better off with this than not? Sure, like I'm okay saying that, but what this isn't is we can't say we're done, because the bottom line is, at the end of the day, as David talked about, all the data shows that you get cell phones out of the classroom and academic performance goes up.
Yeah, bullying goes down, and especially with the most disadvantaged kids.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of those great equalizers that cuts across all your, critical theory groups, right? Like you take cell phones out, and everyone succeeds. And so that was what was disappointing for us, when the governor made that comment in his State of the State address that he wanted to, address cell phones in the classroom. We were like, great, this is going to be really good. And I think what ended up happening is the teachers unions probably got their hands on this some. All that to say, I think this is something we're going to have to get back to address. And we just, I just challenge adults, like, think about how much your cell phone distracts you on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, it's something everyone can admit to. And then just put all of those pressures and all of the just the ups and downs of being a 16-year-old or a 13-year-old or whatever on top of that. And you can understand why these, I'm looking at my cell phone right now, like why these things just are so harmful.
It's an addiction issue.
Yeah.
It really is. And but I mean, the cool things, I think one of the things that this bill did is it kind of raised to the top,
right.
The messaging piece. But it didn't clarify anything, right? A lot of people are still out there. I was at the State House today, and they're still saying, well, parents are not in agreement with, you taking their kids' phone. No, they are. Like, all across the country where we're doing this, parents are in favor. Kids are in favor. And usually what I'm hearing from whether it be Dublin or inner city Akron, right, where they did this in 3 high schools, complete bans, they all say within 30 days, kids and parents line up, and it's just a better environment for everybody.
Right. And again, that's such a silly argument, too. Like, if you went through and surveyed every parent on every policy you have in school, you're going to have a wide variety of disagreements. The answer to that is let's have a bunch of different types of schools that parents can choose from and say, this is where I want to send my kid to, right? So if you're a parent that wants to have your kid have a cell phone in class, somebody can start a school and it could be the cell phone school. And you can do everything. Everyone just plays on TikTok all day, and it probably won't last long.
It's called a digital academy.
Exactly.
They talk about my mean mug family, and it's because I'm not going to mention the member that I talked to, but you go over there, you lay out all of this research, you talk about what's going on locally here in the state of Ohio, what the research says, and they still says you're probably right, but we got to get this done.
Right.
Like, what? Get what done? For what?
Yeah, for what reason? And like, it's not getting anything done if it's not actually addressing the problem. And actually, sometimes I've seen things like this over the years, where bills like this actually long term could be harmful because it gives the mirage of we've done something
dealt with
here,
that.
And the answer is we haven't, right? And the reality is we've talked about this before in other contexts, but we're asking 14-year-old minds. And constitutions to go to war with multi-billion-dollar companies who are spending, millions of dollars every year just to get you to pick up your phone and look at it. That's all. That's their only goal, is if I can just get them to pick up their phone and look at it, and that's why it's halfway policies on these things don't work, because it just the odds are so stacked against kids in this context, and so. Again, glad that we're having the conversation. I thought the governor was right to raise it. I think that the General Assembly is right to talk about it. But what we can't do is act like this issue is solved now, because, really, this is one of those places where I say it's right for the state to step in, because, the state, one, is investing a lot of money in education. They are investing a lot of money in the outcomes that are coming here. And this is one of those things that is making the outcomes worse.
So when kids can't read and kids aren't safe, then, putting a phone in a pouch until the end of the school day doesn't seem like that big a deal.
Right, exactly.
Well, another story that's sort of education adjacent in that it involves graduation, and we're in graduation season, so we're going to hear a lot about these speeches at colleges and high schools, some great, some cringy. Some are, just spouting basic Christian doctrines and things like that, and become the biggest issue that we've seen.
Well, let me say
so far this graduation season.
My second favorite, I'll say second favorite outside of the one we're going to talk about, was the Jerry Seinfeld speech.
Yeah, they walked out
Duke.
on. How you walk out on Seinfeld?
Right? I mean, if you, I know this is not the one we're talking about, but this is like, and just for all of the mainstream media outlets that are saying, these Gaza protests are about Israel, the country, not about Jews. Literally, you could not get a less political Jew than Jerry Seinfeld, and they're walking out on him, right? Which again is also too have you tried to get tickets to a Jerry Seinfeld comedy show? Those things are over $100. They just missed
What's
out.
the deal with walking out on Seinfeld?
He did do the soup Nazi thing once, so that was kind of controversial.
But the best one, the best story on it was the Babylon Bee story that showed that they found the culprit of who was responsible for organizing the walkout of Jerry, and it was a picture of Newman. Yeah. So anyway.
Brilliant. Just absolutely.
It's hilarious.
It's good. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's not the one we're talking about.
Well, we are talking about one that happened over the weekend at Benedictine College in Kansas. Harrison Butker, who is not a household name by any means. If you're an NFL fan, you probably know him as the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs. David,
just like David,
football
exactly.
is a sport that's played.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, but he's had some big kicks in his career. I think he's won a couple of Super Bowls in the last minute or so with a late kick, and he's been really outspoken on the life issue previously. And he gives this commencement speech over the weekend, and essentially just says, "Women, it's okay to be moms, and men, it's okay to be masculine." And the mainstream media and the internet absolutely has lost their mind, and it seems to be growing day by day.
And he condemned Pride Month and was very clear about some big cultural issues going on. First and foremost, what's encouraging to me about this is a lot of this. I think one of the first athletes to really speak out was, I think, Benjamin Watson, and especially on the life issue, and that was amazing. And this is not to say anything negative about Ben Watson whatsoever. What's really unique to me about this with Harrison Butker is that he's in the middle of his career, right? Like he is
peak of his career,
right? Ben was more towards the end. And again, I'm not saying that he might not have felt called to do it before, and so much of these issues have changed. But it's a real sign of courage and credit to Harrison that this is with serious risk. We talked about this actually. I talked about this at the gala. We're calling people to step up and speak out, but you got to count the costs. And I think that's what's amazing about what Harrison has done here.
Yeah, when you see him, just watching it, there's so little about it that would, I think, cause alarm, even if you disagree with it. It's not calling for violence or anything like that. It's really, as I said, just taking those traditional Christian positions that you would expect someone with Christian beliefs to do. And it's almost like the media is kind of tipping their hand, that they're just showing you how much they hate those beliefs, and they just want to attack those and eradicate those from the public sphere.
It'll be interesting to see what the NFL does, right? I think that's the biggest story is how will they respond to the pressure.
Oh yeah, well, that's exactly where I was going to go, David, because they already got a statement out. It says Harrison Butker gave a speech in his personal capacity. His views are not those of the NFL as an organization, said Senior Vice President Jonathan Bean, the league's chief diversity and inclusion officer. They really need it. The NFL is steadfast in our commitment to inclusion, which only makes our league stronger. What did he say that is not inclusive up there? Why does the NFL have a chief diversity and inclusion officer, for one?
I think it's kind of neat because I'm looking for the first female or trans male to play in the NFL and get laid out. Right. So I think that could be fun. Stand up for diversity, equity, inclusion there. Yeah. Right. Explain that move.
No, that's right. Or honestly, I'm looking for the first white wide receiver to actually score a touchdown. That's the. No, let's get out.
Steve Largent would like to have a word with you, Aaron.
No. But again, it just shows how stupid it is what these guys are saying. But and in all sincerity, the thing that upset me about this comment in particular from the NFL is, think about when Ray Rice beat his girlfriend in the elevator, and how long it took the NFL to put a statement out. Right? Think about all of these serious issues that have happened in the NFL, and the silence from the NFL. And here's a Catholic kicker going to speak at a Catholic school and espousing basic Catholic positions, and the NFL has to get a statement out. That's a complete misnomer. That has nothing to do with what he said. And of course he's speaking in his personal capacity. He wasn't wearing his Chiefs uniform and helmet on stage speaking like this and saying, here's what the NFL believes. No, he was speaking in his personal capacity. It was the quickness for the NFL to throw him under the bus. But I actually think or attempt to throw him under the bus, because I actually don't think there is a real bus out there anymore. I think that's more and more what folks are realizing, is that the proverbial bus doesn't exist. And I think I just saw something too that showed Harrison Butker's jersey is selling more than Patrick Mahomes right now, which might be the first time that a kicker's jersey has outsold the quarterback.
Well, the bus that may have hit him on this one is the Taylor Swift tour bus, because apparently he offended the Swifties
with
his
football,
comment.
Mike, because the last time we talked about football, Taylor Swift took over. I don't understand the world, the universe, where Taylor Swift is the center of everybody's football conversation.
Well, no, but this is another good example of this, though. Sorry, like it's what's her boyfriend's name? Kelsey. Travis Kelsey. Like he just graduated from UC or something like that. Either UC or Xavier. I think it was UC, University of Cincinnati. And what did he do on stage when he was given his diploma? He had a beer in his hand, cracked the beer, and chugged the beer on stage in his full outfit, like doing that, right?
In his personal capacity?
It is, right, exactly. As a 34-year-old man in front of a bunch of 21, 22-year-olds. And where was the NFL statement saying, Travis Kelsey was chugging that beer in his personal capacity? And like, it's cowardice from the NFL. I know we shouldn't expect more, but I think this is, I fully expect Harrison Butker to survive this, quote unquote, to keep his job, to do well. There's the change.org petition that's just complete nonsense. But I think he's going to be stronger for it. And I think the more and more we start seeing these stories, you're going to hear today a conversation we had with the Christian Business Partnership. The more and more individuals start standing up and they see, oh, actually, I'm going to be just fine. That's really, as you're going to start to see this tide turn more and more.
And that's a good segue to our interview segment. It's not really an interview. It's just kind of a special feature of that event that we held today, the legislative luncheon with the Christian Business Partnership, talking about DEI policies in higher education. And Aaron, could you just tee that up for our listeners to give them an idea what we're going to get to after the break here?
Yeah, so the Christian Business Partnership is Ohio's Christian Chamber of Commerce. It's an affiliated entity of CCV. Was actually our first legislative luncheon that we held here. So for the members of the partnership, like I said, it's a Chamber of Commerce. So we have members all over the state, large, small businesses, things like that. We host these legislative luncheons to talk about bills going through the State House, especially bills that impact employers. And Christians in the marketplace, and so this was our first one we've done. We did it here in our building. It was exciting to use the space God's given us. Had a full house for it. Brought in a good friend of mine, Jonathan Butcher from the Heritage Foundation, and State Representative Brian Stewart, who's actually been on the podcast before. He was one of the speakers as well. And we talked about these DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that universities are putting in place. That are really, this is closely tied with a lot of the protests you see going on college campuses. But I think for a lot of times, my perception of these DEI policies is that a lot of folks sort of dismiss them on college campuses as, oh, that's just, college campuses are just progressive environments. They're leftist places. It's not a big deal. But there's real life consequences for these policies long term for the workforce. So we wanted to have that conversation, and I thought it went phenomenally well. I was blown away too. Jonathan Butcher even got into sort of the Christian ethic behind, why we oppose these DEI stuff. It was awesome. And Brian Stewart was, again, he's one of these guys that has a great legislative strategic mind of understanding how things actually work at the State House. So that was just powerful. Just a good conversation.
Yeah, and you'll get to hear it coming up in just a minute. And if you're interested in learning more about the Christian Business Partnership, go to cbpohio.org. Plenty of information there, and you can even sign up if you're a business owner and see all the benefits that come with that. So we're excited to share that with you, and it's coming up in just a minute here on The Narrative. Hey, Narrative listeners. Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian chamber of commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org.
There is an apocryphal story of Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai talking to a reporter who asked him his opinion on the French Revolution. And this was in the 1960s. And he said, well, it's too soon to tell. which of course was a fascinating response. The facts, of course, get in the way of a good story because what he was actually talking about was protests that had happened just months earlier in French universities, and he was referring to those. However, the point is well taken, right? And I do think that when Americans look back on this point in our history and recognize that there has been serious opposition to our foundational principles embedded in the Civil Rights Act and in state and civil rights laws, they'll see, right? They will see that this was a departure from what our founding documents and what our founding fathers and, frankly, the virtue that is necessary to maintain our society requires. And they will see that DEI is a big part of that. So I'm going to take a few minutes. I want to walk through diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then I want to close just quickly, and we're going to talk about Christian ethics for just a moment and what DEI and its roots mean in terms of Christian ethics. So first, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, I hate to disappoint you, but they don't know. In fact, the definitions of DEI are very hard to come by. Research from the Iowa Board of Regents just last fall looked for a definition and could not find a consistent definition either across businesses and corporations or in academia. Now, that's not to say that these departments, the DEI departments that we've all heard about on college campuses around the country, don't try to explain what it is. However, it's neither consistent nor, as I'm about to show you, do the definitions match what these DEI offices actually do. So let's begin with the concept here that DEI is a generally ambiguous term, okay? And despite the ambiguity, surveys of corporations in particular have found that it's very common, right? A survey of corporations that was done by some Harvard researchers some years ago found that even though some 80% of human resource officers said that there was no definition that their business abided by, 70% of those responding said they had DEI trainings anyway, right? Most Fortune 500 companies, at least as of a couple of years ago, had DEI trainings as a regular part of their operations. And the same goes for higher education institutions, as well as K-12 schools. So that's one. We don't know what it is, and DEI won't specifically say what it is. And we'll see why that is here in just a moment. So number two, DEI is ineffective. And this may perhaps, if there's one thing that you take away from my comments here, it is that all of the research that has been done, and it's quite a bit, hundreds of surveys of usually employees in businesses about what they felt like going through and then after diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, sometimes called anti-bias trainings, find that it either has no effect on their behavior or attitudes, or it actually makes them resentful of having to undergo the process in the first place. DEI has not been able to change the hearts and minds of those that go through these processes, mostly because it really is not about diverse thought or diverse people, equity or equality under the law, two things that are very different, and then inclusion. Right? And that's why it's not changing people's minds, is because the idea itself does not have any coherent center. All right, but what does draw it together? There's got to be something, right, where DEI came from, and that made it become such a widespread movement across both businesses and in academia. The roots of diversity, equity, inclusion lie in what is known as critical race theory. This, of course, was the term that suddenly everyone became familiar with just a few years ago after lying embedded in higher education mostly for many, many years. I explain the topic in my book, Splintered Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth. And if you go to chapter 2, actually, I felt it was necessary to explain that as you look back over the last 10 years at what is really a period of renewed protests, I would argue riots as well, on higher education campuses, people called it a crisis of free speech. Everyone began asking, right? Is there a free speech crisis on college campuses? There were the shout downs right at Middlebury up in Vermont, a tiny little liberal arts school that few people had even heard of before an AEI scholar and an author was shouted down. And then there was the entire campus that was closed at Evergreen State out in Washington State. And then there was the big protest at UC Berkeley, which frankly would, not make headlines because they tend to have protests all the time. But this was particular, right? I mean, there had been years had really gone by before we had seen outbreaks such as this. But the point of my chapter, and the reason that I bring that up to you, is that when you go on YouTube and you watch these protests filmed in real time, and you see what the students are saying as they conduct what oftentimes were violent riots or violent shoutdowns, they are using the same terms that Marxists and critical race theorists, one and the same, had used in their writings. They used the terms decolonization, microaggression, words as violence. They used these ideas that really came out of the rejuvenation or an attempt to rejuvenate Marxism in the 1920s and 1930s. This movement that was known at the time, once it developed out of Marxism by a bunch of frustrated Marxists in Germany, they were kicked out of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, oddly enough, because they were Jewish, came to the United States and landed at Columbia University, where they developed their concept, known and what was called by their founder, Max Horkheimer, as critical theory. The reason they called it critical theory was because it was a gadfly of what we know as traditional theory, right? The idea that science can lead to human advancement, Enlightenment, traditional values, but key for the American institution is that they rejected the rule of law. They didn't believe that rights were what was significant. What mattered was the Marxist perspective of power and those who were marginalized, oppressors versus oppressed, right? That's where this kind of phrase comes from. And that phrase, oppressor versus oppressed, was actually used by a critical race theorist in a speech once, right? Sometimes they say the quiet parts out loud, and that happened to be one of them. So how does all of this bring us back to DEI? Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion departments didn't begin to proliferate on college campuses until kind of the late 1990s. They were called something else for a while. Usually it was something related to cultural competency or something like that. But in the late 1990s, when California defeated a proposition that would have made racial preferences in college admissions and public hiring required, right? And so that proposition was defeated. Suddenly, there was this move across college campuses around the U.S. to install these DEI offices. And their express purpose was to become the bureaucratic arm of racial preferences, of critical race theory. It's what they do. DEI offices on college campuses advocate for racial favoritism. That's what they do. They wrote amicus briefs in the court case just last year for the Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina. They wrote amicus briefs, many of these DEI offices, in favor of what is called affirmative action, but it's really just racial preferences, right? These offices are there. They are installed on campus to do these things. One of the other things that DEI offices are frequently a part of and have also been addressed by courts are what are known as bias response teams. These BRTs are installed on college campuses so that you can report anonymously, in most cases, to a college official that something offended you. You heard something in class, you heard something walking along the campus grounds, you saw something written in chalk on a sidewalk, a flyer, whatever. You can just go say you were offended. And then the university will conduct an investigation. And that should sound Soviet to you, because it is. It is, right? The surveys that have asked students how do they feel about speaking their mind on college campuses consistently over the last 5, 7, 10 years has found a steady decrease in the willingness of college students to speak freely on college campuses. And these bias response teams aren't the only reasons, but they are certainly a core part of what has gone wrong in higher education. Okay. So now we've talked about the roots We've talked about where DEI comes from. We've talked about the definitions. We've connected DEI to critical race theory. Let me say a few words about the question, should it be taught, though, right? Should we be teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion so that students understand at least the concepts? Well, the model legislation that we have authored at the Heritage Foundation, and prior to that when I was at the Goldwater Institute, has been dedicated to preserving the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We are deeply committed to civil rights. We firmly oppose racial discrimination. We firmly oppose discrimination based on country of origin, of ethnicity, right? We are trying to protect the idea that ideas matter, right? It matters that we have students who can discuss even difficult topics in the classroom. The problem is that critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are not ideas that want to share the stage. There is no other room on the platform once CRT and DEI are there. That's why when students carry out the principles embedded in CRT and DEI, they are shouting people down. They're not renting a room next door and inviting another speaker, right? They are taking the stage, right? And they are kicking the speaker off of the stage. And again, I outline this in my book, but if you'd like examples there is a multitude, right, of examples that we can give of speakers who have been shouted down at colleges both big and small. All right, I want to take just a few minutes here before I finish, and I hope that we can talk more about these details as we move to the Q&A. But I'll take a few minutes here, do something new that I haven't done in a talk on this topic before, but given the audience, I thought it was appropriate. So if it doesn't work, you can tell me later, and I won't do it again. So in the world of Christian ethics, right? Generally speaking, we can kind of divide ethical considerations into three groups. I'm going to borrow from a author and theologian named John Frame here. You can break this into normative, situational, and existential. In normative ethics, the question is, what does God tell us to do? In situational ethics, the question is, how can we change the world and bring glory to God? In existential ethics, the question is, how must I be changed if I am to please God? And so with these three parts, believers are encouraged to go forth, right, and think through the answers to each of these questions as we live out our lives, right, in the space of family, of church, of business, of culture. In the normative sense, right, God makes it clear that there are some principles that are very important, that should be prioritized. A couple of these include justice, mercy, faithfulness, as well as loving our neighbor as ourselves, loving the Lord our God, right, first and foremost. The normative in critical race theory and in diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is not justice, it is power. Right? That's why they describe the world in terms of a power struggle. That's how Paulo Freire, who many of the critical race theorists drew their ideas from, as well as Marx, that's how they describe the world. It's not justice that they're looking for or equality under the law. They want equity. Equity is equal outcomes. And the only way to achieve equal outcomes is through manipulating the law to make it fair to some and unfair to others. Herbert Marcuse, who is a critical race theorist and also one who says the quiet part out loud all the time in his writings, wrote that rights really don't matter and rights don't have to be fair. Right? That was his point, was that rights needed, and he actually said this, rights need to be taken away from some and given to others. Ibram X. Kendi, I'm not going to belabor the point here, but Ibram X. Kendi makes a similar point, right? When he is saying discrimination is necessary today to account for past discrimination, it will be necessary in the future to account for present discrimination, right? They're not looking for justice, they're looking for power and a redistribution of resources, which sounds nice, but only if you're the one who gets to do the redistributing. All right, so situationally, how can we change the world to bring glory to God? The word that is used in critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion is resistance, right? That is their situational perspective. Their attempts to change the world around them are based on the belief that since government and social institutions are systemically oppressive, these institutions must be dismantled. Again, they have said this. You can quote straight from Duncan Kennedy, for example, who's a professor at Harvard and one of the founders of what is known as critical legal theory, which was a precursor to critical race theory. And he says that they are committed to dismantling American institutions. Derek Bell, one of the godfather of critical race theory, he said, critical race theorists are committed to a program of scholarly resistance, and most hope scholarly resistance will lay the groundwork for wide-scale resistance. So they're after revolution, just as Marx was. All right, existential. Critical race theorists' existential perspective is not to seek redemption or sanctification, or forgiveness for that matter, but to define the extent of one's victimhood to make others feel guilty if they disagree with their position, right? Their objective is to define the world in terms of, as we were saying before, oppressors and oppressed, but defining it not in terms of personal improvement. It's in terms of personal revolution and then collective revolution, right? That's the objective. And of course, from the perspective of believers, right, the answer to the question, how must I be changed if I am to please God, is that lifelong process of sanctification, of returning always to the cross, remembering our own sin, remembering that before we judge others, before we condemn others, we have to look at our own sin and be forgiven, to be committed, right, to that process.
It's encouraging to see how many Christian business leaders are here, not only engaged in our economy, but lending your voice in areas of public policy. And that is hugely important. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, if you are working with CCV, you are working with the best. And that's the perspective I bring from working in the building across the street. There is this sense I think some people have of like, well, the best way to pass legislation is still, you get your corporate lobbyists and they hang out at the bars all day and they've got all the best golf clubs and they hand out all the biggest checks. But a good thing I can report is in 2024, it's not that way. It's really not that way. The reality in 2024 is that the organizations who are most influential across the street are the organizations who we legislators know actually speak for our constituents and who can mobilize our constituents and who speak for the concerns that you have, and that is CCV. I've only been here 3 years, but we've been involved in several major high-profile fights alongside CCV. I want to give you just one example so you kind of get a sense of why it's important to be engaged in things like this. I'm the vice chair of the Public Health Policy Committee. We are the committee that held all the hearings on House Bill 68, the SAFE Act. And obviously that's gotten a lot of attention, and I'm very pleased with where that bill ended up. But I think it's important to point out there was a stage in that legislation where a lot of people, even with seeing victory in sight, were kind of willing to, halt the tanks, right? And take half a loaf and, we'll just ban the surgeries. We won't get into those messier issues of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. That makes some people uncomfortable. We'll take half the loaf. Gary Click said no. Our chairman said no. I said no. Our committee said no. CCV said no. And as a result, we didn't stop short. We took the whole loaf, and we made sure that not only, thank you. And so we've not only banned permanent destructive sex change surgeries on minors, we've also said that we're not going to even get to that point because we're not going to be doing cross-sex hormones. We're not going to be doing puberty blockers. I got to vote for that 3 times in committee, on the floor, and to override the veto. And I do believe that's going to be the law in the state of Ohio for many years to come. I briefly want to point out as well that, I worked a lot last year on our Constitution, trying to protect it and trying to keep abortion out of it. And all I want to say on that is obviously those did not go the way I wanted, didn't go the way I think a lot of the people in this room wanted those to go. But I point that out because it is very easy in politics to find people who are willing to stand beside you when you're cruising towards a win. It is much harder to find people who will stand beside you when you're pushing the boulder up the hill, when the outcome's not certain, when you need to stand up and do the right thing for its own sake, not just because you're going to get the results you want at the end. And that is CCV as well. And I'm grateful to work with you guys. But I'm here to talk today about DEI as well, and I can't do a lot better than our previous speaker, and he said it exactly right. It's diversity, equity, inclusion, and we don't really know what else. It's three kind of gauzy words strung together. They don't really mean what they refer to. It's kind of like Inflation Reduction Act, right? It's pitched with this gauzy language, but I found a quote from a former practitioner. This lady was the head of the DEI department at a California university. So at one point she was a true believer, but she has come around and said, DEI is built on the unshakable belief that the world is divided into two groups of people, the oppressors and the oppressed. And at base, that's what we're talking about. And yet, after 2020, you had a 30% uptick in 1 year in the number of corporate positions posted asking to hire a DEI professional. This is a race and gender obsessed ideology. It has quickly resulted in a lot of the widely mocked stories and memes and things that we see, these sort of horror stories. The Washington Post recently had an article that actually said Discovery Channel's Shark Week lacks diversity because it overrepresents white men named Mike. But beyond these kind of goofier stories, the serious threat here is that DEI does encourage race and gender preferences that discriminate against people based on race and gender in the name of inclusivity. And so, and it also in the employment context, a lot of times results in these sort of mandatory training programs, i.e. corporate HR brainwashing sessions, that employees have to go through as a condition of keeping their job. Unfortunately, and what concerns us at the Ohio State House, is that DEI insanity largely starts on our college campuses. It then graduates into your workforce. Now, the problems with this are obviously legion, but I found a great, my own congressman is named Brad Wenstrup. He wrote about this very recently. He was pointing out that it's inserting itself into medical training. To the point, and he's a doctor, he said characteristics such as skin color and adherence to DEI ideology are being prioritized above student qualifications. The ability and education of America's newest physicians, the health of our nation's future patients, will perilously atrophy unless something changes. He pointed out that there was a mandatory course on structural racism for first-year medical students at UCLA. A guest speaker at the medical school led chants of free Palestine, referred to the October 7th Hamas terrorist attacks against Jews as justice. She demanded that the students bow down to Mama Earth and led what she described as a non-secular prayer to the ancestors. In this mandatory course, Structural Racism and Health Equity, the aspiring medical doctors were told that modern medicine is white science and asked to stand for a so-called second prayer against the occupation of Turtle Island. Anybody know what Turtle Island is? It's the United States, according to the DEI practitioner. This DEI professional was fired after she raised the alarm that DEI was the source of this rising anti-Semitism that we're seeing on our college campuses. In the DEI worldview, the Jewish people are the oppressors, the Palestinians are the oppressed. Case closed. Jews good, Jews bad, Hamas good. And so in the days after October 7th, I've been very concerned about what I've seen on some of our Ohio campuses, including my alma mater, The Ohio State University. If you want a good time and see the true unhinged nature of the left, visit my Twitter account, look at my replies. It's quite the show. There's an adjunct professor at Ohio State named Pranav Jani. He helped organize And he spoke at a State House rally across the street in which the crowd chanted at the Ohio State House, "Long live the Intifada," and "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." These are calls for the genocide of the Jewish people. Professor Johnny, a taxpayer-funded employee at Ohio State, organized this rally by sharing a disgusting flyer which featured the Hamas paraglider. The Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at Ohio State, for which Professor Johnny is a student advisor, posted this same paraglider flyer to advertise their events and referred it on Instagram to Hamas as, quote, "our heroic resistance in Gaza." Ohio State University. Now, I bring up Professor Johnny not only because of his numerous anti-Semitic public postings that are sympathetic to Hamas, not only because he made his account private and blocked me on Twitter after I publicized his activities to tens of thousands of people. I bring him up because he also just so happens to be the most vocal opponent of Senate Bill 83. And Senate Bill 83 is a bill to rein in exactly these types of DEI initiatives on our public universities here in Ohio. It is sponsored by Senator Jerry Serino, for whom I am pinch hitting today. And I support the bill. We've advocated for the bill. We've passed it out of a committee in the Ohio House, but we have hit a snag with the Democrats, and the speaker, who is beholden to them, does not want to let that bill come to the floor. Senate Bill 83 would ban mandatory DEI programs at Ohio universities. It would prohibit requiring students to espouse certain viewpoints or ideologies as a condition of their grades and their graduation. It would prohibit hiring practices that favor applicants based on race, gender, and political ideology. How do we end up with faculty that where liberals outnumber conservatives 95-1? Because they hire for that explicitly. Senate Bill 83 would overhaul tenure programs at our universities, making it easier to fire professors who espouse Hamas talking points at taxpayer expense. And it would also require the teaching of American history. What a concept. Is it any wonder, then, that Professor Long Live the Intifada is opposed to the bill? Ohio cannot be surprised when our graduates come out of our universities espousing insane views on issues of the day, when we allow them to be subjected to insane people teaching insane ideas as a condition of receiving a bachelor's degree. We need to take DEI in our state institutions seriously. We need to pass Senate Bill 83 and other bills like it. We need your help to advocate for these bills in the Ohio General Assembly. And I'm encouraged today because I believe organizations like this are the best antidote to this kind of woke insanity, far more than any law that I can pass ever would be. You are the first line of defense to DEI garbage because you can say the one thing that these DEI practitioners fear the most. No. You can ignore these dumb ideas. You can refuse to implement stupid policies. You can encourage your employees to act like real human beings rather than robots raised in the Oberlin College Gender Studies Lab. Okay? Destructive DEI policies lose all their power when we have the courage to stand up against them. Who better to stand up for what is right than Christian business people? Matthew 16:24, Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Keeping our eyes focused on the cross rather than the momentary fads of what is of this world is what defines us as Christians. Understanding that what is popular is not always right and what's right is not always popular is something we embrace as Christians. If your businesses judge people based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, I believe you're going to succeed in business. I believe you're going to be a place where employees want to work, and then you'll be a business that competitors who are wasting their time on DEI want to emulate. And if a group of Christian businesses gathers together with a strong unified voice, you're going to quickly become a force to be reckoned with in this state as well. And I believe that other business organizations in this state are going to want to emulate you as well. I want to leave you with one final thought. One of the first questions I usually get as I travel the state in 2024, being in politics, is why on earth would anyone want to be involved in politics in 2024? Now, the first part of my answer to that is that I got into politics after serving in the infantry during the Iraq War. After 9/11, I enlisted for active duty. I did roughly 150 combat patrols throughout Baghdad, and then I made it home when 6 friends did not. And so God has kept me here for a reason. I'm figuring out what it is. I'm never going to take this country or this state for granted, and I feel like I have a responsibility to earn every chance at life that I have that my friends do not. But the second part of my answer is this. If you think it's bad now, imagine how much worse it would be if all the people who were in this for the right reasons, who love America, who believe in and follow Jesus Christ, all decided that public service is just not worth it. We need Christians in the fight. We need Christian businesses to make Ohio succeed. Thank you for stepping forward to lead, and it's an honor to be in that fight with you. Thank you.
I want to kind of start here, Jonathan in particular, and we'll come to you, Representative Stewart, next. We're big believers at the Christian Business Partnership and at CCV that ideas have consequences, right? And so I think for a lot of folks, when they might see some of this protests and riots going on campus, the instinct is to say, well, this is just youthful exuberance. It's everybody goes through their hippie phase or whatever in college, but this is different. Why is this maybe different than other protest movements or things we've seen going on at campus? What's so particularly egregious and harmful about DEI mentality on college campuses?
Well, there's been violence on college campuses before, certainly, but it is up to the adults to act like adults on college campuses. And what we've seen instead is some of these college administrators have given into the demands that students have made, right, for additional departments, additional faculty positions, teaching from the perspective of either DEI or being, frankly, flatly pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas, right? And all of that shows students is that it's not the ideas that matter, it's power that matters, right? It teaches them that lesson. And so you're preparing the next generation not to go out and be in an office with people with whom they disagree, but to be difficult with whoever they meet, right? And to show that if they exert enough power or find the lever of power, that will then lead to whatever success they're looking for. Critically, and one of the things that I didn't mention here is that a number of states now are in fact pushing back, right? Texas and Florida were the first ones last year. They essentially prohibited the use of taxpayer money on DEI programs in either public businesses or in universities. Now we've got Iowa just did it this week. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, so not statewide, but just that large flagship university in North Carolina, their board did it all on their own and said, we're going to take all the money that was going to go to DEI and we're going to put it towards campus safety, which is both poetic, I think, as well as practically, very sound. But there's a number of states that have done this now, and I think that they're seeing straight through what's going on here. If college administrators will not act like adults, then the state lawmakers have to.
I want to stay there for a second, Representative Stewart. A few years ago, I believe this was right before you came in, but actually a piece of legislation that Jonathan and I worked on together a few years ago was called the Forum Act, which was a free speech on campus bill. I can't remember what the acronym stands for anymore. But Ohio passed a bill to protect free speech on campus. This was, at the time, in response to a lot of campuses, protesting, violently rioting against speakers like Ben Shapiro coming on campus, which, by the way, takes on a whole new color to it now that you think about them trying to keep Ben Shapiro off campus as a Jewish man. But when that bill passed through the State House, every single Democrat voted against the bill to protect free speech on campus. Let me ask. A lot of folks, you just saw the Democrat minority leader in the House, Allison Russo, really come against Ohio State for saying, hey, you can't set up tents on campus, things like that. Are these, whether some of the universities stopping encampments on campus or stopping protesters from taking over buildings, is this a violation of free speech? Obviously it's not, but what's the difference between what's happening now from a legal standpoint to what we're trying to protect with free speech on campus?
I don't begrudge Left-wing campus activism is nothing new. I think the difference, though, is, you have the right to protest. You don't have the right to set up a hobo camp for a week. And, I think that's really where Ohio State kind of drew the line. You can be there. There's, time, place, and manner restrictions on the First Amendment are almost as old as the First Amendment itself. And so in the same way that you can protest on this part of the street, but you can't actually go into the building and heckle somebody, we've always had these kind of boundaries around what is possible. And I think what we're talking about is if somebody wants to, carry the Hamas sign up and down the sidewalk at Ohio State, I think they're an idiot, but I think they probably have a First Amendment right to do so. If they want to bring in the, conveniently all the same green tents that George Soros paid for and camp at Ohio State for a week, that's where we kind of need to draw the line. And I would just point out as well, before I went in the Army in 2002, there were anti-war protests, and that was par for the course. But like a lot of things in life, the window has kind of continued to shift. And, back in 2002, I remember people saying, well, I don't think America should be in this conflict or another. But they weren't carrying the Al-Qaeda flag, right? And so the change here has gotten to the point where we're literally cheering a terrorist organization. And that's quite an escalation. And as a state legislator, I was on another panel about higher education. And it was right after October 7th. And I almost canceled because I was like, I've had nothing good to say about higher education for like the last month. Do you really want me to come? Like, oh, we'd love your perspective. I said, okay, well, I'll come and give you both barrels. And what I said at the seminar was, if I was getting out of the Army today, like I was in 2006, and saying, where am I going to go back to school? I don't know that I'm going back to a place that tolerates Jewish kids being harassed on campus, Hamas sympathizers taking over the student union. And thankfully, I think Ohio State has kind of woken up and at least drawn a line at the camp. But the problem is these students, as crazy as they are, graduate into becoming legislative aides for the Democratic caucus across the street. Let's just be honest. And even though we've had this a lot of times where I've got, colleagues on the other side, they're like, well, I'm a lot more moderate, but these, my pool of applicants to be my aide, it's 99 out of 100 are like the kids trying to camp at Ohio State. And so this window keeps being moved, and that's a concern.
Well, I would just add, the definition of harassment is if it interferes with learning, right, on campus. And so these protests they forced Columbia to move all classes online. That sounds like it interfered with learning, right? They canceled graduation at the University of Southern California. I mean, they are literally interfering with the process of what the university is doing. So there's no question in my mind that this is not free speech. And you defined it very well, right? Anyone who is lawfully present on a public college campus in a publicly accessible area has the right to speak and be heard there. However, the university can set time, place, and manner restrictions, especially inside buildings, and then also outside in areas that people need to walk between to get where they're going. At Emerson up in Boston, they blocked a right-of-way in downtown, right? There's no claim here that this would be free speech. And then last, just real quickly, so I have my column today actually talks about the one missing link in this free speech conversation for many, many years has been a select few states, Arizona being one, North Carolina being another, when they adopted additional protections on free expression in recent years, they added in disciplinary sanctions. They said if you violate someone else's First Amendment rights, the university must consider either suspension or expulsion, depending on the situation. And many other states that enacted free speech provisions didn't. And so now that's why you had them set up the encampments, and the university said, well, it almost looks like free speech, right? And then they started interfering with campus activities. Well, it's still kind of free speech, but maybe it's not, but we're not going to punish them. And then they burnt the place down, and now they're like, oh, well, we're going to call in the police, to which the New York Times and the Washington Post and everybody else on the left and PEN America says, you're violating free speech now, right? I mean, come on, this is silly.
Absolutely. I remember actually Brian was talking about what was going on at OSU, and to President Carter's credit there, after a little while, he said exactly that. They had requirements at OSU to say, listen, after 10 o'clock, you can't protest on the quad because you have dorms all surrounding this area, and finals are coming up, and kids are studying, and they need to be able to sleep, and that's a reasonable and neutral, content neutral time, place, and manner restriction, which is allowed. There's one aspect of Senate Bill 83 that hasn't gotten as much attention, and this issue generally in the DEI conversation hasn't gotten as much attention, but it really calls out the influence that China is having on our universities. And Jonathan, I want to start with you here on this. Kevin Roberts, the not so new president of the Heritage Foundation, when he came in and set his agenda for the Heritage Foundation, I think one of the things that really jumped out to me was a really strong concern about what China is doing in America today. Can you talk about the influence that China is trying to exert and has exerted on our universities, and even the impact that could have on these DEI policies as well?
Well, I think the two biggest things to be concerned about with China are that first, it actually is not a concern with China, it's a concern with the Biden administration, because they have stopped keeping track of foreign donations to universities. There's a rule for the U.S. Department of Education to track foreign contributions to universities. Universities have to report that to the U.S. Department of Education. They flat stopped. We don't know how much money is coming from foreign donors to universities, and they are supposed to. The federal government is supposed to be able to tell us, but they're not. So that's the first problem. I think the second problem is that what used to be called Confucius Institutes have basically been uncovered for what they are, which is an arm of the CCP, and now they are renaming themselves. So I think some of them have been closed. I think many others have simply been renamed to something else. So I think that's an ongoing concern with China specifically. I think with foreign donations more broadly, particularly from the Middle East, there is a lot of money going to universities from other nations, particularly in the Middle East. And this isn't a phobia here. We have to be very realistic about where these universities are getting their money from, because there are demands on what they do with that money. And on top of that, when a university gets a grant, a big part of that is just considered indirect costs, right? Overhead. And they can use it for whatever they want. Some of that money is to be used for whatever scholarship or program or department that was specifically directed, but there's usually a slice off the top, it could be 10 to 15%, that the university uses to pay administrators and to pay salaries or to fund the DEI office, which arguably is what's going on because money becomes so fungible in higher education.
But I want to kind of turn the conversation just for a moment here to the impact that these DEI policies have on hiring, right? We have a lot of employers in this room, the impact these DEI policies have on corporate America. And I think, Brian, in particular, what has been your experience as a state lawmaker with where corporate America is broadly? The lobbyists that come down and talk to you, that is there an awareness, a concern over DEI, or do you get the sense that in a lot of corporate America they're actually encouraging this, or is there just a lot of fear? What's the experience for you down here at the State House on this?
Yeah, I would say when you talk to lobbyists from different business industries, or even the leadership of the actual companies, a lot of times what you'll get is, yeah, we think that's crazy too, but we have to do it. Right. And the other excuse is, well, we might think it, I don't really agree with it, but to be competitive for workforce, we have to do it. And that's always kind of the excuse as well. If we don't have, if we don't embrace these sort of DI policies, we'll never be able to attract the talent that we need. You also hear this a lot. For 20 years, this has been the case in Ohio, right? It's, well, you can't pass the SAFE Act because then no businesses will want to locate in Ohio. You can't pass a heartbeat bill because no businesses will relocate to Ohio. On and on and on and on. And I finally asked one of these lobbyists, and you've made this prediction for literally 25 years and never been true. I mean, Intel, Honda, PPG, Amazon, we're growing. The reality is, I think it's just kind of a cowardice of, scared of the folks underneath, because I've never met a business yet that's been like, well, we were going to go to Ohio for that, high quality workforce and that, favorable tax environment, but gee golly shucks, they passed a bill that said they can't mutilate kids' bodies. We're not going to go, right? That just doesn't happen in practice.
Yeah, I'll just say to that end, I remember a few years ago, Equality Ohio, the large LGBT group in the state, formed a group called Ohio Business Competes, and they said Ohio has to pass one of these bills that says boys have to be allowed in girls' bathrooms and all of these types of things. And they said it's going to be good for business. We have to pass this to be competitive. And what they would always use was surveys. They would poll college kids and say, would you want to go someplace where you could be fired for being gay? Which, by the way, is not happening. No one can document that it's happening, all these types of things. And of course, a college student says, well, no, who would want to do that? But every time we would come back and say, hey, look, here's the top 10 states for business. And guess what? None of them have passed these laws, right? And I should say, it's not necessarily just because they protect religious freedom that those states are good for business, right? It does reflect broadly a less regulatory environment, right? That's what these laws are. They're pro-regulation. But the reality is, for most people, they're not looking at these things, right? They're looking at what's a good environment for my business to grow, a good taxation environment, good regulatory environment. But the narrative that the left is pushing, the media has pushed, has been otherwise. For folks in corporations, in large businesses, right, that might not be able to just unilaterally implement it, how should they go about, pushing back against this ideology effectively, even if it's not a Christian environment that they're in, especially if it's not a Christian environment that they're in?
So obviously, I'm kind of talking from the legislative side, but I think that in Ohio, I describe it as we're really easy to get to, right? It's not like DC where you got like 16 levels of security and then you got to set up an appointment. I mean, if you walk off the street and get through the one metal detector, you can be in the halls, you can be at any committee meeting, and you can meet with your legislator. And what I've seen is, it's really helpful to us to be able to say, well, if somebody like you came and said, hey, I work at such and such bank, okay, and the bank has whatever policy it does, it has it's got the little DEI section on its website, but I just want to give you some feedback about what I think or what's really going on. That's relatively confidential. Like, if you asked, your legislator's not going to say, I met with this person. But I think each individual person in Ohio has a real ability to influence policy, because I've just seen it time and time again where a legislator might have met with half a dozen lobbyists and listened to 2 hours of testimony. But that one person from back home that they respect, who knows the issue and can get to them directly, can oftentimes outweigh all of that other kind of pomp and circumstance. And so everybody in this room who has a perspective on these issues, by virtue of being in some of these companies, your resume is such that, a lot of your legislators are going to pay more attention, right? I mean, if you're the VP of something or the director of this, there's a credibility that comes with your background where, a lot of people will lean in a little closer and listen to what your perspective is. And I would encourage people to use that.
So I have good news and bad news. All right. So the good news is that it's highly unpopular, right? The surveys asking people, especially about racial preferences, over and over again, find overwhelming results. I mean, we're talking as high as 80+%. They don't like the use of racial preferences. Americans don't like it. They agree. Okay. We have also had public interest law firms, right? Southeastern Legal is one, the Goldwater Institute, Pacific Legal Foundation have been representing individuals who have said they have been discriminated against at work under the auspices of DEI, and they have been represented. I mean, we are taking this to court. Students for Fair Admissions was just getting started, apparently, with the Harvard and UNC cases, because now they've taken it to the Naval Academy at West Point, I think in particular. So they're taking it to those military institutions as well. So there are people out there to help. If, once you begin talking about it, you'll find that people do agree, and you're not the only one saying, I don't think that word means what you think it means, right? And other people are going to say, you're right. I don't think it means that. All right, so that's the good news. The bad news, and this is a lot shorter, it is going to take moral courage. I mean, you're going to have to say in a DEI training, you're just going to have to raise your hand and say, wait a minute, I don't like the way you're going here, because it makes it sound like because of my ethnicity and skin color, I am inherently oppressive or biased. And I don't think that's true, right? You're going to have to be, someone is going to have to be able to speak up. But I don't think you're going to be alone, right? I think someone else is going to say, it feels that way too. And I don't like the way this is going. But once you get there, I do believe, right, that not only are there, is there legal help that will help you, but the surveys continue to show that Americans don't like this. And it only takes a few people to speak out. And just real quickly, I mean, I interviewed a chemist in Oklahoma a couple of months ago, and he went to a DEI training and could not believe what he was hearing. America was being condemned. I mean, the whole oppressor versus oppressed shtick. I mean, the whole thing, right? And he said, look, he actually told me he was mostly politically neutral. He's like, I don't really care on either side here, but what I was being told didn't fit with anything that I believed or understood. And he actually took the case to the Ohio Board of Psychologists. And so this is a state board that is supposed to say whether or not something, some teaching, some book, some psychologist is an actual practice of psychology. Because this guy, his name is Chad, he went to someone who had worked for the Defense Department who had studied and been involved with the interrogations of terrorists, which is pretty rough stuff, right? I mean, this was pretty aggressive stuff that the military had done. And she said, the stuff that they were doing in this DEI program is basically what they did when they were interrogating terrorists. Like, this was ugly stuff that people are being told that everything about them is wrong, kind of thing, right? And so he took it to this board in Oklahoma, and the board refused to rule. They wouldn't even touch it, right? And so now it's turned into a lawsuit and it's ongoing. But he clearly, he picked something, he pressed a button, and now people are aware and understand. Now it's become a big thing. But I think the lesson here is that once if you just politely, as a believer, raise your hand and say, I just don't think what you're saying is consistent with the Civil Rights Act, and you can't force me to believe that. Just so you know. I think people will agree with you.
Just a couple thoughts to that point as well, to the question as well. One, the Christian Business Partnership does have for business owners, but we've not thought about this for folks in corporations. We do have recommendations of HR companies and HR advisors who do what we'll jokingly call conservative DEI training. Right, so a lot of businesses say they want to do something around the idea of celebrating diversity, and there's ways of doing that, which we've done for generations of celebrating all types of diversity, not just do we look different and think the same. And so we do have recommendations on that front, but I think that's something we'd absolutely love to talk to you more about how do we bring policies forward. This is something for those of you who are executive members of the Christian Business Partnership. We're going to be doing an event at the end of June up at Strive, which is Vivek Ramaswamy's investment company up in Dublin, Ohio, on ESG. And what ESG is doing in environmental, social, and governance investing is doing in corporate America. And one of the things that Strive has done really well is they've gone to these companies, they own shares in these companies that are pushing DEI corporately, and they've said, hey, don't push that. That's actually going to exclude people from investing or working at your company. Here's policies that actually would invite folks to work here. And they've been pretty successful at that. So I think there's good opportunities there. That's also where I'm going to leave the plug on, if you are not a member of the Christian Business Partnership, you should talk to Shar or Sam on the way out and make sure you sign up. And if you're not an executive member, you can upgrade and be invited to that special forum we're going to be doing up at Strive at the end of the month. With that, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And I hope that you have a great week. God bless and have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.